Ever wonder what the movie There Will Be Blood is based on?
No.
All right, maybe I'll skip this story. Well, if anyone is interested, it's based on Oil by Upton Sinclair. Ever wonder who the main character of Oil is based on?
I'm dying to know. I'm dying to know.
As I choke that out of you. Why, Edward Lawrence Doheny, of course.
Doheny of Doheny Drive.
Doheny of Doheny. Ever wonder what Doheny was known for? Oil.
He wrote the book.
He wrote the book on oil.
Doheny's Upton Sinclair.
Book.
Oh, okay.
But keep in mind in this story, there will be blood.
So Doheny is Paul Thomas Anderson and Upton Sinclair.
So Edward Lawrence Doheny was born in 1865 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. In his youth, he would prospect for gold, but eventually he moved on to prospecting for oil, and in 1892, he and his friend Charles A. Canfield became the first to strike oil in Los Angeles. So this was obviously very profitable, and they eventually began to mine in Mexico as well, and became the largest producers of oil in the world with Pan American Petroleum. So the only man to rival Doheny's power in the country at this time was Rockefeller, and he was an LA boy, not Rockefeller. Doheny had married a woman in 1883 named Carrie Luella Wilkins, and together they had a daughter and a son. The couple were divorced by 1889 as Doheny had fallen in love with a telephone operator over the lines.
Sarah from Andy Griffith?
This whole story inspired not just... Ever wonder what the character of Sarah that nobody talks about from Andy Griffith? So they fell in love over the lines. Her name was Estelle Betzold. So Doheny married Betzold, and their little daughter that he had with his first wife ended up dying at age 7. In response, Carrie, who was his first wife, drank some battery acid and killed herself.
Wow.
But this story has to do with the Doheny boy.
That Doheny boy. That Doheny boy is on my lawn again. Sorry.
With his slingshot and his shorts.
And his $1 million shoes.
So as is the tradition, as we know, with LA higher-ups, Edward Lawrence Doheny's son was named Edward Lawrence Doheny Jr.
Creativity runs in Richmond.
In the city. It must be in the LA River. So he went by Ned, so we'll call him Ned. He was born on November 6, 1893. No surprise, he grew up very rich and privileged. He graduated from USC, and then he married Lucy Smith, who was the daughter of another oil man, W.P. Smith from Pasadena.
Okay.
So they had 5 kids. One of them, Edward Lawrence Doheny III.
Is this how rich men think immortality works?
If you can name your son after yourself and force him into the family business, he's you.
They all think they're Zorro. Yeah, just put a hat and a mask on him and Zorro never dies.
He inherited the mantle of Edward Lawrence Doheny, as every boy dreams. So Ned's life and his exploits were always in the news. He was famous for being famous. He was like the Kim Kardashian, or a more dated reference, the Paris Hilton of his day.
Go more dated.
O.J. Simpson.
That's good. No, he earned money.
Yeah, he earned it.
He earned it.
He earned everything he got. But we can only hope that their stories end up the same way as Doheny's story. So along with getting a wife, Lucy's dad assigned one of his workers to be the chauffeur of the 2 young lovers. This was a man named Theodore Hugh Plunkett.
Love the name.
So Plunkett eventually advanced to Ned's personal secretary after World War I. But more than that, the two, Ned and Plunkett, they grew up together and they became very close friends. So while their friendship was growing, Doheny Sr. decided he wanted to get a leg up on some oil rights in Kern County. So he sent Ned and Plunkett to Washington when they were done with their vaudeville show.
The greatest superhero team.
Ned and Plunkett.
Ned and Plunkett.
So he sent them to Washington, D.C. to deliver a briefcase filled with $100,000 cash to the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. So this and other similar transactions got called to the attention of the public in what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal, if you remember that from history class. As all of you probably never went to school who listen to this, it's a place you go to learn. So this was the huge scandal of its day involving the government giving out favors to a select few oil companies, and Doheny became a big part of this whole debacle. So Doheny Sr., that is, was indicted in 1924, but actions against him were delayed. Indicted along with him were Ned and Plunkett for being the ones that actually delivered the bribe. So this was a very stressful and disgraceful time for the family, but life had to go on. In 1926, Doheny Sr. gave Ned a gift, maybe for the trouble that he was putting him through over ruining his life. So he gave him 12.58 acres of land in Beverly Hills.
Okay.
Ned decided to build a mansion on these grounds. On February 15th, 1927, construction began. So the grounds were to have stables, kennels, tennis courts, a pool, a greenhouse, a lake, waterfalls, and babbling brooks, and it even had its own fire station. And then there was the mansion itself.
Wow.
So the mansion was designed by the architect Gordon Kaufman, who also designed the new LA Times building, the explosion-proof one, that is.
You see an exploding building, I see an opportunity.
One building goes down, two go up. This mansion has 55 rooms,
Jeez.
7 chimneys in there that are each designed by a different artist, each one.
Sorry, you couldn't see me roll my eyes. Go ahead.
You're a one chimney man, I get it. It has 46,054 square feet of living space and sweeping views of LA and the ocean. The mansion was to cost $3 million. In today's dollars, that's $40 million. It was to be called Greystone because they used a lot of stone to build it, and the stone was gray.
You're wonderful. That must have took a lot of research.
How do I find stone?
What color is it?
Are there any quarries within the city limits? So it was the biggest house in LA when it was built, and the second biggest in California behind only Hearst Castle.
Oh.
So it's located at 501 Doheny Road in Beverly Hills. So vain. Construction took 3 years to complete, but it was complete enough for Ned and his family to move in September of 1928. So meanwhile, while this beautiful castle was going up, Doheny Sr.'s trial was being scheduled to be held in 1929, and the date was coming up. Family was getting nervous. Especially nervous were Ned and Plunkett. So Plunkett was particularly distressed. Apparently, he was suffering some sort of mental breakdown around Christmas of 1928.
Because Santa didn't know what chimney to go down. There was 7 of them.
Also, he was going through a divorce, and he was having some sort of bad gingivitis.
All this money, and he wouldn't go to the dentist.
You gotta save. Heading into 1929, Ned didn't want to have to testify against his own dad, and Plunkett knew that. And Plunkett himself, not being a part of the family, he saw that he was starting to look like a pretty good fall guy for all of this. So this was the environment heading into February 16th, 1929, a mere 5 months after Ned and his family had moved into Greystone. In the late afternoon of that day, Ned and Lucy visited Plunkett at his apartment to urge him to get help for his increasing nervous meltdown that he was having. So after this, Ned and Lucy went to see a show, and then they headed back home, as you do after you confront a friend who's having a meltdown. So at night, Plunkett came to Greystone at around 9:30. He had his own key to the place. He let himself in, and he had Ned called for to meet him in one of the many sitting rooms. The two old friends were alone together in the room for a couple of hours, and then this is how the official story goes.
Oh, boy.
At 11:30, Lucy heard a gunshot. She immediately called the family doctor, Ernest Clyde Fishbaugh, who was in a movie theater at the time. Was he watching James Bond? Who knows? So he was paged out of the theater, and he rushed over to Greystone and showed up some 20 minutes later. When the doctor came, he and Lucy went to the room that Ned and Plunkett were in. They came to the room to be greeted by Plunkett holding a gun and yelling, "You stay out of here!" And then he slammed the door on them, and then a second gunshot was heard. They went into the room. Both Ned and Plunkett were dead with bullet holes in their heads. So the police showed up, and a sweeping inquest was promised into this sensational incident. But 36 hours later, the call was made, murder-suicide, and there would be no further inquest. The case was closed.
Wow.
Reporting stopped after 3 days. This was Beverly Hills' first murder, and not the last. Here's where the official story, though, starts to fall apart. When the police showed up, the doctor said nobody had touched the bodies, but Ned was on his back, and the way that the blood had dried over his body couldn't physically have happened if he was on his back. So then the doctor started changing his story, and he said, well, actually, he moved Ned's body to try to revive him. And then the story changed even further when it became clear that Ned was actually alive still when the doctor had showed up, but then he died soon after. And then smaller details started to change, like, well, no, Plunkett, he closed the door softly. He didn't slam it. And then even stranger, several family members were called over to the house before the police were. The police weren't called until 2 a.m., and this supposedly happened at 11:30. So the witness statements from the staff also sounded heavily rehearsed, and the family seemed to be acting very suspiciously. Now, for the murder scene itself, the gun was next to Plunkett's body, but strangely, there were no fingerprints on it. Even stranger, it was warm. too warm. So warm, it felt like it had been placed in an oven before the cops came over. Also, on Plunkett were burns on his fingertips from holding a cigarette. So if he had been holding a gun and a lit cigarette, why wouldn't he drop it somewhere between slamming the door in the doctor's face and shooting himself?
Yeah.
So you know what didn't have burns on it? The bullet wound around Plunkett's head, meaning that he couldn't have killed himself and he must have been shot from a distance. But you know whose wound did have powder burns around it? Ned's, which means that he had to have been shot from within 3 inches. So going by the facts of this crime scene, it looks like Ned was the one who killed Plunkett and then killed himself. So then there's other reports that it had actually been Ned who called the doctor, but at 10:30 to get him to come over to give Plunkett a tonic to calm him down. If this is true, then that means the doctor would have been there before anybody was shot. And then another theory claims that Plunkett did kill Ned for suggesting he go to a mental institution. Another says he did it because he wanted a raise. One popular theory that people like is that Ned and Plunkett were actually gay lovers and that Lucy killed both of them.
Wow.
So even more confusing is the way that they were buried. Because the Doheny clan are all buried at the Catholic Cavalry Cemetery in East LA, but Ned's buried in Forest Lawn. And there were huge crowds that showed up for his funeral, but even more confusing is that the Dohenys paid for Plunkett's burial as well. But why would they pay for the supposed murderer of their own son?
Yeah.
And he's literally buried a stone's throw away from Ned and Fort. Like you could see, well, I have a picture, like you can see both of their graves in the same image. So this could be confirmation of the Ned as murderer theory, because if you had committed suicide, you were not allowed to be buried in a Catholic cemetery.
Oh.
Yeah. So Doheny Sr. eventually went to trial, but he was acquitted, many think out of public sympathy over the loss of his son. All Ned got was a library named after him at USC. Lucy then went on to get remarried just a year later, and she continued living in Greystone until 1955.
Her husband was killed.
Yeah, well, that's her old husband. She moved on. So the history of Greystone did not fail to one-up itself when years later, one of the servants hung herself in the living quarters and another one slit her wrists in the meat locker.
Jesus.
And after that, a 7-year-old girl fell to her death out of the upstairs nursery window. And the house is also riddled. There's hidden rooms, there's passageways that they were using during Prohibition. Again, in 1955, Greystone was sold to a man named Paul Trousdale, and from there to a man named Henry Crown, who also owned the Empire State Building at the time. And in 1965, the city of Beverly Hills bought the land from Crown because he was going to tear it down and turn it into little houses. Beverly Hills got it, and they installed a 19 million gallon water tank and turned it into Beverly Hills' largest reservoir. From 1969 to 1982, the American Film Institute was headquartered there at a yearly rent of $1. In 1971, the grounds were made a public park, and in 1976, it was added to the National Registry of Historic Places. The park's open to the public, but the house is used for special events, but you could book a tour of it. Most notably, it's used to film a lot of movies. It was in Spider-Man, Big Lebowski, Ghostbusters, Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, The House of the Damned, Austin Powers Goldmember, to name a few of them. The main staircase has been called the most filmed staircase in the world. Here's the weird thing. They actually filmed There Will Be Blood there.
Really?
And the bowling alley at the end of the movie is actually an original part of the house that they like restored it for the movie. Wow. And they filmed it all in there. So every summer they also do a murder mystery show based on the Ned murder case. Now for the haunted part of this.
I was kind of curious.
There are many ghost sightings in Greystone. Some of the park rangers have supposedly seen things so disturbing that they quit right on the spot. Others refuse to go into the house during the night shift. People have seen butlers, cooks, and maids wandering around that aren't alive. The most frequently seen ghosts are of a woman who smells of lilac, most likely Lucy's ghost, and that of a man in suit and hat standing in front of the murder room, which is very creepy. Here's There Will Be Blood. On one occasion, an artist had pictures hung up on the wall inside the murder room as part of an exhibition, so he took them down and he was starting to seal up the holes that his nails had made in the wall, and then he noticed some blood on his hands, and when he looked up, there was blood oozing out of all of the holes that he had made in the wall with the nails. And a more frequent occurrence has been, like, they'll be in that room, they'll see a puddle of blood on the floor, and then they'll look back on it and it'll fade away.
The Ghost of the Puddle of Blood.
I love that band. So nobody will ever know what exactly happened that night, but the official story certainly is not true. And that's that one.
That's more than I ever knew about Doheny, really.
All you'll ever need to know. A murdering teapot.
That's the Beauty and the Beast sequel.
If Beauty and the Beast, the Teapot Dome scandal. Lumiere's Great Escape.